look! It's my feral friends and fellow nature nerds tuning in to Dirt Dispatch number 34. And I, of course, am your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara. So the first thing I want to tell you about today is something that's been on the news, at least around here because it's relatively local. Colorado has just about completed construction on what, when finished in December of this year, will be the world's largest wildlife crossing, spanning I-25 between Denver and Colorado Springs, the two most populous cities in the state. It's officially called the Greenland Wildlife Overpass, and when done, it will span 6 lanes of Interstate 25 and measure 200 feet wide by 209 feet long. It's wide with a gradually sloping entrance and will encourage wildlife to use the crossing rather than trying to dodge interstate traffic. Now, Colorado has more than 100 wildlife crossings across the state, but most of them are tunnels. Tunnels are great for smaller animals, but they tend to be avoided by larger ungulates, hooved animals, who prefer clear sight lines and tend to avoid enclosed spaces that restrict their mobility and may not be able to accommodate a big old rack of antlers. So the overpass is primarily intended for big game like deer, elk, and pronghorn. The location of the overpass is a place that's known to be where these animals have a high degree of movement. It addresses a nearly 4-mile gap in wildlife crossings in this area and will connect 39,000 acres of big game habitat in Douglas County on the east side of I-25 to over 1 million acres of the Pike National Forest on the west side. Currently, there is, on average, at least one wildlife versus vehicle crash per day in this area. So it's anticipated that after the project is finished, it'll reduce wildlife vehicle collisions by 90%. So yeah, kudos to Colorado. If we're going to keep building and expanding and quote-unquote improving highways and interstates, wildlife crossings need to be a part of the calculus. I mean, first and foremost, they just work. In areas of known wildlife movement, wildlife crossings, when combined with other elements like fencing to guide the animals to the overpass, have reduced wildlife vehicle collisions by up to 97%. One wildlife overpass in Arizona, as of 2020, was used more than 6,000 times by bighorn sheep, bobcats, deer, coyotes, and more. In Florida, wildlife crossings have increased the gene flow and prevented vehicle collisions with Florida black bears. In Canada's Banff National Park, studies show that wildlife crossings reduce roadkill, increase access to food and shelter, and even decrease stress levels in wildlife. Case studies from around the world show that wildlife crossings mitigate the harm caused by habitat fragmentation, something that I've mentioned all too often as a threat to many of the species I've told you about. And if just doing it to protect wildlife isn't enough, here's one more reason. According to the Colorado Department of Transportation, over 5,000 vehicle-animal collisions are reported annually in the state, costing an estimated $80 million in cleanup, medical expenses, and animal losses. So just doing some rough math at an average of 1 accident per day and about $16,000 per collision, that stretch of I-25 would average just under $6 million of that $80 million figure. The cost for the Greenland Wildlife Crossing, remember it's the world's largest, is $15 million, which means that it will pay for itself in less than 3 years. So ultimately, wildlife crossings just make economic sense too. Okay, so now I want to talk about some cool members of the insect world that I spotted this week. First, we had a poplar sphinx moth hanging out on one of our window screens here at Dispatches HQ for a day last week. Now, the whole reason it caught my attention was its size. Poplar sphinx moths have a wingspan of 5 to 6 inches, 130 to 150 millimeters. There's 2 different color morphs of poplar sphinx moths, gray and pale. The one that I saw was pale, which is yellowish or sandy brown, with well-defined lines and bands. The upper side of the hind wing has a crimson patch, although I didn't get to see that on this one. Overall, they're not super colorful. They're moths after all, primarily nocturnal. If you think about butterflies, those bright colors are an advertisement to predators that they taste bad. You might recall that it's called aposematism. Moths rely more on darkness, camouflage, and erratic flight patterns to avoid getting eaten. Now, as the name suggests, their larvae feed on poplar trees, also cottonwood, which we have in abundance here at Dispatches HQ, aspens, and willow. They're kind of like the beavers of the moth world. Now that brings me to the other insect that I saw. I was riding my bike down a gravel road and I saw something moving across the road in a sort of jerky fashion. Stopping to see what it was, I found a dung beetle rolling his golf ball-sized ball of poop across the road. Now there's lots of different species of dung beetle, but they're divided into 3 functional types: tunnelers, dwellers, and rollers. What they all have in common is that, well, they eat and lay their eggs in poop of herbivores and omnivores, apparently showing a preference for omnivores if they have a choice. Some also eat mushrooms and decaying leaves and fruit. Most species find the dung using a good sense of smell. No surprise there, right? But some will attach themselves to the dung producer and wait for, well, fresh product. I guess it's kind of like when Krispy Kreme Donuts turns on the hot now light. Tunnelers tunnel under the dung, burying it right where they find it. Dwellers just move right into the dung pile, living in it or right below it. And then there are the rollers, who roll up the dung and roll it away from the pile. They use comb-like projections on their legs to scrape dung together and make it into a smooth ball. Then they roll the ball by walking backwards with their front legs on the ground in a sort of handstand and rolling the ball with their back legs. When rolling a ball like this, the beetle will follow a straight line regardless of obstacles. In fact, it used to be thought that dung beetles would help each other get a ball over obstacles, and sometimes a mated pair will roll the ball together, but the reality is that dung beetles will steal dung balls from other beetles. So a lot of times what looked like help, quote unquote, was really an attempted hijacking. Usually, though, it's the male doing the rolling and the female following along. When they find a spot of soft soil, they stop and bury the ball, then mate underground. Because, nothing puts her in the mood like a big ball of buried poop. The female lays eggs inside this quote-unquote brood ball, and the larvae feed on it when they hatch. Now, I knew that dung beetles performed an important function in the ecosystem by cleaning up poop and returning nutrients in the soil. But what I didn't know was this. By removing dung, both by tunneling and consumption, dung beetles reduce the amount of dung available for flies, which reduces the number of flies that livestock producers have to control. Why is that important? Well, it turns out flies can be problematic for livestock. When cattle are getting bit by biting flies, they're more stressed. They spend less time eating and more time swishing and twitching. This impacts how much weight they gain, so livestock producers need to spend money to control the flies, usually through the use of pesticides, which aren't exactly healthy for us humans either. Okay, top 5 dung beetle fun facts before we wrap this one up. Number 5, dung beetles are found on every continent except Antarctica. Number 4, the daily dung of a single elephant is enough to support 2 million dung beetles. That's a lot of poo. Number 3, dung beetles are some of the strongest animals alive in relation to their size. One species, known as the bull-headed dung beetle, can pull 1,141 times its own body weight, the equivalent of an average person pulling 6 double-decker buses full of people. Also, bonus, this beetle has been deliberately introduced in many places, including the United States, to help clean up cow pastures. Number 2, dung beetles are often attracted by the feces collected by burrowing owls, who carpet the entrance to their burrows with feces in order to attract other insects, which they then can eat. And number 1, Some nocturnal dung beetle species in Africa orient themselves and navigate using the Milky Way, the only known insects to do so, or by polarization patterns in the moonlight, the only known animal of any kind to do so. How cool is that? All right, if you want to support the podcast, here's some ways you can do that. Become a patron. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and with 3 paid months, you get some very cool Dispatches from the Forest merch. You can find all the details at patreon.com/dispatchesfromtheforest. You can donate using PayPal and my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com, which you can also use to email me with any questions, comments, or requests for future episodes. You can donate using the Cash App and the hashtag ForestNerd, or if you prefer to just send a check, shoot me an email. I'll let you know what my mailing address is. Check out the merch store at cafepress.com/shop/dispatchesfromtheforest. Then click on products and you'll find something that you like. Finally, follow Dispatches from the Forest on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. Dirt Dispatches is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.